Hello, and welcome back to the continuation of this presentation, where I discuss Mannheim, the late 17th century work from Sweden, which claims that Atlantis is in Scandinavia, where the central question we try to answer here is how this can even begin to make sense, right? So we deep dived into Ptolemy's map in the last video. And I just want to add one extra thing before we move on to the topic of the day, which is the Riphean Mountains and the central arguments why they are placed between Finland and Russia. And that is the Issedones, that I want to add one more thing. It says that on Bugis side above Motis, as we've discussed, the Sarmates and the Issedones dwell. And we see here that Rubek likens the Issedones with the Estonians. So this is what I want to expand a little bit on. So here is Asia number 8, the map. This is on the Russian side in Rubek's framework. Otorakora or Moscow, we said we're here. This is what the map looks like. Here is Moscow. And to the northwest we have Issedones-Skythica, and to the north Issedones Magna. And Rubek claims that these Scythian Issedones are the original Issedones, and that these are the Estonians, and that these are relationally placed correctly because these are northwest of Moscow, right? And if we move Moscow 50 degrees to the left, maybe we should move the Issedones 50 degrees to the left as well. And if we put them in the same relationship to each other, they basically end up here in Estonia, rendering Issedones as Estonians, right? These Issedones are described as bordering on the ends of the world, according to in Herodotus' work. Why this actually makes a lot of sense if this is where the closed off area to the world began, beginning with Finland. He wrote that Aristeas said, "Beyond the Issedonians dwelt Arimaspians, a one-eyed race, and beyond these the gold-guarding griffins, and beyond them the Hyperboreans extending as far as the sea." So the Arimaspians are, in Rubik's opinion, here in Finland. This will be further discussed down the line sometime. And the lands beyond the Issedonians has no eyewitness, according to Aristeas. And the reports come from the Issedonians. So these were in talks with the Hyperboreans and thereby the Atlanteans. And it would make sense if the Issedones are Estonians, right? Then they are on the border of these closed off areas, which the Greeks and the Romans had no knowledge of because they didn't have access to it for several reasons, which we will also get into further down the line at some time. There's one big source, which I haven't mentioned, which is Herodotus. And he starts counting Scythians from Borysthenes, which is around here, also above the Black Sea, basically. So this is where Rubik therefore places most of these Scythians, near Finland and Russia, and some all the way into Sweden as well, the royal Scythians. There are several interpretations herein which are problematic. I don't really know to what extent they are justifiable, actually. So this, and it's also a very extensive text. So this will be a presentation on its own where I discuss the merits of his interpretations of Herodotus' work. Now, we will get to the topic of the day. The Riphean Mountains, the famous mountains of the Hyperboreans, which many of the later scholars have connected the Hyperboreans to, right? And these are claimed to be along the Finnish-Russian border. They actually are the Finnish-Russian border. So we've covered the later Riphean Mountains, which are in Ptolemy's map, in Idre, in Dalarna, in Sweden, in central Sweden, what is Svitjod. And these are, in Rubik's opinion, the later Riphean Mountains, and the earlier ones being far further up north on the Finnish-Russian border. This is where the first Scythians went to after the fall of Babel, according to Rubik. But after the flood, at least. to hide in height of elevation, and these were the furthest place they could go following the rivers upstreams, right? If you follow a river upstreams, you should ostensibly get a height in elevation, right? So the most famous source which claims that the Riphean Mountains are along the Finnish-Russian border is again Adam of Bremen, which is a source that is used. This is a very good source because it is one of the more later ones, but it still describes this older world, right? This is from 1000 CE, around there. So Adam of Bremen, he describes the Riphean Mountains in Scandinavia in several places. The most prominent one being in page 206, where it says that on the east, Sweden touches the Riphean Mountains. Here is his map. As you can see, here are the Riphean Mountains, according to Adam of Bremen, on the border between Finland and here is where Russia begins. There's another scholar from just about before Rudbeck's time called Albert Krantz. This is also a German source. As I said, most Gothicists were either Scandinavians or Germans. And this is a German who was basically a Gothicist. And he wrote in the Nordic Kingdoms that Sweden has the Riphean Mountains to the east, and soon after are the Russians. So this is he's describing them on the Finnish-Russian border, right? And now we will get into the central or the main argument that Rudbeck makes as to why the Riphean Mountains ought to be these mountains on the Finnish-Russian border. And that is the place name of Aldesco, which is said to receive rivers from the Riphean Mountains. And this place name is mentioned in several sources. The one we're going to look at today is from Dionysius Alexandrino, 200 CE. They are in these sources as well, but I haven't found them yet. It can be quite tricky sometimes. But these sources claim the same thing, that Aldesco receives rivers from the Riphean Mountains. So this is what Dionysius Alexandrine wrote in the Sea to Orbis. I double-checked Rudbeck's translation, and it checks out, basically. The only difference being frozen ocean became frozen ravines, or frozen ravines became frozen ocean in Rudbeck's work. Otherwise, this is actually a very fair translation. So it says that by Lake Aldesco, many streams go into the Riphean Mountains, and beside them is the frozen ocean, fine amber and glowing diamonds. So frozen ocean, fine amber, this is quite clear northern calling cards, right? But what is this Aldesco according to Rudbeck? He wonders if it is the Ladoga Lake east of Finland. So the Ladoga Lake has an alternative name of Ladesco, and Rudbeck believes that this is a distortion of the word Aldeo, which then became in Latin Aldesco. And that this is the lake that receives rivers from the Riphean Mountains here along the Finnish-Russian border. Here you can see the alternative name of Ladesco, right? And you can see down here that it has a town of the same name, Ladoga and Ladoga here. And this town in ancient mythology had the name Aldeuborg, which you can see in this saga of Hervarar saga. Aldeuborg, the city of Ladoga, south of the lake of the same name. Today it is called Ladoga, just as the lake is called Ladoga. And Rudbeck therefore wonders if the town was called Aldeuborg, was the lake therefore in ancient times called Aldeo? So Borg is a suffix meaning fortress, so the fortress of Aldeo. Would then this fortress be a fortress of the lake Aldeo, having the same name as the town, just as it does today? So Rudbeck believes this because the name Aldeo means Alda, which means waters and big waves. And I actually found this to be true in the modern Edda versions. So in this version of Edda on page 230, you can see that Alda means sea, and the scholars have added that it also means waves. So this basically is the exact same thing that Rubik says, right? That Alda means waves and sea. So could then Aldeiborg basically mean fortress by the waves and the sea, or the lake in this case? Could Aldeo mean basically water? It's like a nautical term, right? It would make sense since Dionysius Alexandrino described this lake by ice, amber, and diamonds, right? So ice, this is pretty obviously the northern calling cards. Amber is very famous for being Scandinavian. And the only question then is diamonds. Do diamonds exist in Scandinavia? Diamonds are, of course, more of a Mediterranean phenomenon, at least when it comes to big and beautiful ones. But they actually do exist here in Scandinavia as well. In recent times, they found diamonds in Snashögarna in Jämtland. So this is a little bit further up in north in Sweden, but not in the Riphean Mountain areas. But Rudbeck himself said that there was a scholar in his time called Samuel Otto who visited these places, and that he found diamonds in various sizes in the Riphean Mountain areas, most being very small, but some up to 7 to 15 centimeters even. A small selection of them. And he himself admitted that these were not as fine as the Mediterranean ones, but they exist here. So now you have the quick and basic arguments for why the Riphean Mountains might be in Scandinavia. And when you have this knowledge and this framework, we will discuss the Cimbri and Cimmerian connection. So this is basically a Scytho-Scandic conception, right? The Cimbri are from Denmark, or so they say, and Cimmerians are from Asia and are Scythians. So this would be a Scytho or Scytho-Scandic connection, right? And we will discuss this through the Orphic Argonautica and compare it with the descriptions of Pliny, and we will see how these descriptions correlate with each other quite well. And these quotes will be paraphrases just to make it easier to understand, right? It is much more complicated wording and such forth in the originals. So the Argonautica travels, you may know the Jason and the Argonauts. This is another version from Orpheus' perspective. And Orpheus is quite problematic because up until around the 18th century, Orpheus was actually believed widely to be even more ancient than Homer, Orpheus and his texts. This is not believed today generally. This will be discussed by me further on when I discuss timelines and chronology in general. For now, just know that Orpheus was viewed as being the most ancient writer up until fairly recently. Therefore, we will look at the Orphic Argonautica instead of Jason and the Argonauts. So this is like, there are several interpretations of his travels, right? But this is one generally accepted, and this is quite common conception of his travels through Russia here and then by Sweden. Rudbeck believes that these Scythians here and Hyperboreans are actually here in Scandinavia. Why he believes that they pass through here and by the Riphean Mountains here and then go here. Like this instead. And there are several interpretations and such forth that I will not include here. This will also be further down the line when I discuss the Argonautic travels more extensively in the future. Just for now, this is the route that Rudbeck believes they take. So now we will look at the text. It says that we traveled past the Arctic Pacti, the proud Lely, and the Scythians, and then the Tauri. So they would be, if these are Scandinavians, the Pacti are Piteå or Baggar, rams. The Lely would be Luleå, and the Tauri would be Tornio. And just as they are in the order in the text, they are in order in the travels if you travel past Scandinavia. And the Scythians are like an umbrella term for all of these, ostensibly according to Rudbeck. So this is their modern placements today, right? Piteå, Pacti, Lowly, and Tornio. He would travel by them in this order, if this was Scandinavia. And then it continues that we traveled past the nomadic Hyperboreans and Caspians. After 10th dawn, the Riphean Hills. From here, through a narrow strait, into the Cronian Sea or the Dead Sea. The Hyperboreans would be in Finland in that case. And the Caspians, according to Rudbeck, is along the Baltic Sea on both sides. There are Kassar, Kassaby, Kasby, and so forth. He found many place names and peoples with these similar kinds of names along the Baltic Sea area, along the shorelines. And then lastly, they would travel by the Riphean Mountains. So this area, this is a very traveled path, according to Rudbeck. And they would travel here, past the Riphean Mountains, and into the Cronian Sea. Here we have the first example of Rudbeck proposing that the Cronian Sea is the White Sea. And we will see this further on down the line in other sources as well, for instance, Ogygia as well. And then the text continues, pulling the ship, we came to the Cimmerians with no sun. The Riphean Mountains and the Calpius block it. So here the Cimmerians are described as being in darkness, where there is no sun, right? And that the Riphean Mountains here and the Calpius block it. The Calpius would be these mountains here then. You can see it goes like a theater around why it would block the sun so much. And we also saw how Plutarch said that this was the place that Homer described as the place of the dead, right? The Cimmerians. It would be here because of this lack of sunlight. And now we will compare this description and Rudbeck's understanding of it with the description of Pliny and Rudbeck's understanding of it. So he also mentions the Cimbri in this case, but we've shown how some historians liken the Cimmerians and the Cimbri as being the same, right? And he also describes the Cronian Sea and the Dead Sea, and he describes Scythia as being in the Baltic area as well. We will now describe the outer portions of Europe. After passing the Riphean Mountains, we follow the Northern Ocean on the left. Here are many islands with no name. One is opposite to Scythia, called Banomana, 1 day's sail from the mainland, which has amber. So the first thing we should note here is that all these place names are described as separate islands, and I will come to why he describes all these place names as separate islands. Just know that this was a very misunderstood place, and that this is actually the most island-filled place in the world by far, and that is the source of this misunderstanding. I will come to this in the end of this presentation. So this is how Rudbeck conceptualizes these place names as being correctly placed in Scandinavia. He believes that Scythia basically begins where the Baltic Ocean ends, right here. And this is also where Atlantis ends, right? And Scythia would have been just above Atlantis. Continuing, the rest have no shore reports. In the Northern Ocean on the Scythian shores is the Amalcian Sea, also called Moromerusa, or Dead Sea by the Cimbri. It goes until Rubeus, where the Cronian Sea begins. So the Amalcian Sea is up here, and this is very similar to the Gothic name Amalians, the ruling elites of, is it the Visigothic Empire? Could they be from up here in the far north? According to Jordanus, they are. So here you can see that instead of the Cimmerians, we have the Cimbri instead. And the Cronian Sea would also be in the same place as well. So both Orpheus and Pliny describes the Cronian Sea and the Cimbri or Cimmerians and Scythians in the same area, according to Rudbeck. And if we go to Homer, he says that the sun went down and all was dark, and we reached the ocean's boundary. And there are the Cimmerians who have no sun. So here it is the Cimmerians which have no sun instead of the Cimbri. Diodorus Siculus, 100 BC, he wrote that the most savage Gauls are under the Bears on the border of Scythia. Some say they overran all of Asia under the name Cimmerians, now called Cimbrians. So he also does this equation between the Cimmerians and the Cimbrians. And as I said, the Cimbri-Cimmerian connection is Scytho-Scandism, or proto-Gothicism. This is also great evidence of this framework being much older than Jordanes, and where Jordanes got his ideas from. Continuing with the Pliny quote, after he has described the Scythians and the Cimbri in the far north, then we come to Germany with their mountain Scytho, larger than the Riphean cliffs, going along the shore to the promontory of the Cimbri. So the Scytho mountains are always conceptualized to be the Scandinavian mountains, except in this paragraph. Then the scholars of modern day try to make this mountain into a German mountain because they believe that Germany was originally in Germany, right? So they make this immense mountain following a shoreline into something in Germany, which just cannot work, right? This must be Scandinavia. It is an immense mountain following a shoreline going up to the Cimbri, which is in darkness, which Denmark is not in darkness, as the far north is. This is quite obviously a Scandinavian description. And here again, we see that the Gulf is filled with islands, and the most famous one being Scandinavia. And this misconception that this place was filled with islands is actually not wrong, because Scandinavia is actually filled with islands, just not as literally as they heard it, right? Scandinavia is actually the most island-filled place in the world by far. So if you combine Sweden, Norway, and Finland into Scandinavia, and compare it with the second most island-filled place in the world, Canada, it is still 13 times more. And Scandinavia, of course, has way less shoreline than Canada. So it is actually 30 times more islands in Scandinavia than in the second most island-filled place in the world, even. So it is not even close, right? So of course the scholars of old heard that this place was filled with islands. They just took it literally, as you can see here on Pomponius Melas' map. He also heard that Scandinavia was filled with islands, and this was probably a description he heard a lot about, because it is so filled with islands, right? He just took it literally because he couldn't visit these places. He just could go by the texts, as we've said before. This is how the old texts worked. They went on reports. They didn't copy the world. This is a projection of his understanding of the world, again, filled with islands. And Scandinavia is filled with islands, so it's not wrong. He just took it too literally. And these are some of the scholars that described Scandinavia as an island, right? Ptolemy, Jordanes, Pliny, Procopius, and Thule, which we'll come to one day. Pomponius Mela also describes it as an island. And this misconception is actually quite widespread, even up until almost into Rudbeck's time. So Philip Clover himself did not believe that Scandinavia was an island, but he criticized those who believed that Scandinavia was an island, right? Here you can see what he himself believed Scandinavia looked like. And these are some of the proposed names of this island or peninsula, which Rudbeck claims also belongs to this area. Scythia, Germany, Mannheim, which is part of the title of the work, right? And this is Banno Manna in Pliny. So Banno means land, according to Rudbeck, and Manna is man. So land of man, or Mannheim. Also Basilia, also found in Pliny and other sources. Abalus and Elixoia, which Rudbeck believes is like a Greek transliteration of the Nordic word Helig Öja, which became Elixoia abroad. And this is the land of the Hyperboreans, right? So in the next presentation I will delve more into these topics of Ogygia, Hyperborea, and Atlantis, which all describe the same place, according to Rudbeck. We have a saying in Sweden, kärt barn har många namn, which means a loved child has many names. And this is the reason why this place has so many names in history, because it was so large in history, according to Rudbeck. And also because of branches of cultures that moved and spread, got different names due to different leaders and so forth. A new king could name his country a new name from his title, and so forth, why it changed more drastically than it does today. So this is what we will delve into in the next presentation and see what merit it has and what the problems are with it, because it's not problem-free, of course. This is one man who makes mistakes. But if you can't wait for the next presentation, I suggest you look at this video from David Vos, because this opens up the discussion and the question about this. Could Atlantis be in Scandinavia, and therefore would be part of history and much younger than we usually describe it as today? Today we usually describe Atlantis as being these 9,000 years before Solon, right? What if it is actually much more recent? This is a question that David Vos poses in this video. And I'm opening up the question here, because no classical source speaks of the Hyperboreans as this very old people, for instance, who lived long before everyone else. They were always contemporaneous with the other tribes, the Scythian tribes and so forth, right? It is only we who put them this far back in history, though no historical document describes them as that old, right? So for instance, Pomponius Mela describes the Scythians. The Riphean cliffs reach even into the snowy parts of Europe. The first humans are Scythians, the first of them the Arimaspians. After them the Issedones go all the way to Meotis. So here we have the Riphean cliffs being associated with the Scythians, for instance, right? So in the Argonautic travels, according to Rudbeck, they always travel past Scandinavia and some of the mythical places as well there, right? For instance, the Eridanus River, which he believes is the Baltic Sea. And the Eridanus River is also by Diodorus Siculus associated with Atlantis. And they also travel past the Riphean cliffs and the Hyperboreans. And this is not these 10,000 years before Solon, right? This is more recent, according to these historians. Plutarch, when he describes the Gauls, he says that the Gauls were of Celtic stock. They abandoned the country, and some of them crossed the Riphean Mountains and occupied the remotest parts of Europe. And Gauls is even more so a recent tribe, right? And they traveled past the Riphean Mountains, again being much more recent, not these 10,000 years before Solon, right? This is recent. Heraclides lived not long after their capture of Rome and heard from the west that they were called Hyperboreans. Plutarch does not believe this, right? But we're just gathering these reports, right? Pausanias, he also describes the Gauls, that they inhabit the most remote portions of Europe near a great sea that is not navigable due to its extremities. Through their country flows the river Eridanus, again, which has been associated with Atlantis, on the bank of which the daughters of Helios, or the sun, are supposed to lament the fate that befell the brother Phaeton. Recently, they were called Celts, both among themselves and by others. So the Gauls are associated with Eridanus. It's associated with the Phaeton story. And all scholars agree that the Gauls are Celts. And he also says that the Celts live on the farthest borders, which is uninhabited because of the cold. So again, these are northern calling cards, seeming that they came from the far north. Again, these Riphean areas. And as I said, Phaeton is a Greek sun myth where the sun of the sun crashes into the river of Eridanus. And I will show in the next presentation how these descriptions are basically of the far north in Scandinavia. Diodorus Siculus describes Atlantis. Speaking on the myth of the Atlanteans, he says that Hyperion was murdered and his son Helios drowned in the Eridanus River. So Eridanus is in Atlantis in Diodorus Siculus' report. So, posing the question, could the Atlantis story actually be much later than we usually think of it as? Not these 9,000 years before Solon, but actually, in Rudbeck's opinion, 9,000 moon years, which in Rudbeck's opinion is the way the Egyptians counted the years in this time. This will also be part of the Chronology series, which I will do later on, because this is very many premises for in the future in the argument. But if you conceptualize the 9,000 years as moon years, you actually get a quite interesting correlation with the Gothicist sources, because it would be then about 1400 BC, if you counted. Then it would be 700 years before Solon, right? Not 9,000 years before Solon, which would then be about 1400 BC. And this is the first large exodus out of Scandinavia, according to the Gothicist sources. Johannes Magnus has them at 1430 BC. Albert Kranz, which we mentioned when we talked about the Riphean Mountains, he placed the Riphean Mountains along the Finnish-Russian border, as we said. He says that the Goths went out of Sweden in 1460 BC. And the most famous Gothicist source of Jordanes says that they fell to Belisarius in 554, and that it had gone 2,000 years at that point, right? Which lands us at 1400 BC. Quite interesting, right? This is very much so just a small taste of what is to come in the future. But I will see you in a few days when I begin discussing the Atlantis, Ogygia, and Hyperborean theory of Rudbeck, now that we have laid the groundwork of the Gothicist argument, right? There's, of course, still a lot to flesh out in these, but this is just to lay the conceptual groundwork to understand the Atlantic argument a little bit better. So I hope to see you in a few days. Thank you so much for following along so far. And thank you so much to SlideGo, which is where I got this presentation from. It is very beautiful, actually, I think. And I use it because Rudbeck himself was a botanical worker, right? So I think it fits very well. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.